Hey guys, it's Emerald the Green Eye here. Sorry about that. I'm recovering from a cold, as I said before. So, this is going to be a different video on my channel. I'm going to do an alternate history election on what if Teddy Roosevelt beat Woodrow Wilson in the 1912 election. Now, the reason Teddy Roosevelt didn't win in our timeline was because he ran as an independent under the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party, and he got very close to dethroning William H. Taft in the election primaries, but didn't quite get there. So, what if he did succeed in overthrowing Taft in the primaries and got the nomination for a third term? That's what I'm going to try and be figuring out. So, let's start off first things first. The South would be safe for a Woodrow Wilson. It was very Democrat at this time. Um, yeah, these southern states would have been very safe for Wilson, and I'm gonna give him Missouri too, because at the time, there was Jim Crow going on. There was the South that was opposed to several things like women's suffrage, integration of the army, um, or just rights for black people in general. It was pretty bad, but uh, yeah, Roosevelt, he ran a very quote unquote progressive agenda, which means that he was for giving the vote to women, and he was also for integration of public spaces and the United States Armed Forces. So I think with this progressive agenda, he'd win his home state, which was New York, because at the time, all these northeastern states pretty much either swung Republican or were swing states. Keep in mind, 1912, over 100 years ago, was a very different time. So Roosevelt would win New York, he'd win New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Vermont was safe Republican at this time. In fact, Vermont actually voted Republican more times than any state in the Union before it became state safe Democratic. Don't quote me though. So yeah, Roosevelt would win New England. I think he would, his progressive agenda and oops, his progressive agenda would, I think, and his popularity would win him Massachusetts, because Massachusetts at this time was becoming more of a swing state. He'd win Delaware, which was another safe GOP state at the time, and Indiana, safe GOP, Illinois, safe GOP, because Roosevelt would do well in Chicago. Roosevelt would also win these Midwestern states out here. There we go. Oregon and Washington, California at the time, they were all pretty rural and pretty safe for the GOP. Arizona and New Mexico, this is the very first election they could vote in, actually. This was when they were integrated into the Union. Minnesota, it was good for the GOP, so that means Roosevelt's already won over Wilson, because you got to keep in mind, Wilson, he was a heavy supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan actually rose to more popularity during his presidency and kept itself alive during his presidency at a time where it was dying out. So many people argue that Wilson is responsible for refueling the KKK. I'm not going to comment on that. That's just what people think. But so I think Roosevelt would win Ohio too, even though it was Taft's home state. I mean, the only other option is Debs, and I think that Wilson, he was pretty much, when you think of old-fashioned Southerner, the not the charming kind, but the hard R kind. I don't think he'd win any of these northern states. Now we're just left with the border states and Iowa. I think Roosevelt could narrowly win Iowa. I do think that would be a toss up. Actually, no, I think he'd win it by a decently sized margin. I was thinking because Wilson could have appeal to some of the rural class, but I don't think that would be nearly enough for him to win the state. I do, however, think that I do think that Wilson could win Maryland, because at the time Maryland was technically a southern state, and yes, it is it did swing either way at this time, but I think that Maryland wouldn't go for Roosevelt, mostly due to the Taft situation. They'd be so pretty sore about that. I think that this was also at the time that West Virginia started voting Democrat. So I think that West Virginia would have narrowly gone to Wilson. I think he would have been able to appeal to the miners and the coal workers there, get that rural white vote. I'm gonna come back, and I also think that would be I think Kentucky was a pretty good toss up at this time, but I think Wilson would win Kentucky for the same reason he won West Virginia. I do think that Roosevelt could win Arizona and New Mexico simply due to they both had very low populations at the time. That's why they weren't states for so long. And B, Roosevelt just had that appeal to the rural class voters. I think he could carry those two states. Now it all comes down to Oklahoma. This would probably be the closest state had this election played out in real life. I think that I think that Oklahoma, it's just far away enough from what's known as the Cotton Belt, these rich southern states. I think it's just far away from that to be able for Roosevelt to win, but hmm, it was swinging GOP at this time. In fact, it was actually kind of a toss up, so mostly due to the farmers. And I think that because of the harsh primary with Taft, I don't think Roosevelt could win the state. I think that Wilson would carry it narrowly. So this is it. This is what if Roosevelt won the Republican nomination in 1912. He'd get reelected by pretty much a landslide because he was still very, very popular of a president, and he would be the man leading the country through the end of the Edwardian era and into World War One. That would be a really interesting alternate history video that has been made by a few channels, including Monsieur Z. So I'm I think I'm gonna link his channel in my description so you can go watch that. Anyway, this is my prediction on what if Roosevelt won 1912, or how we could have won 1912. I'm Emily, and I see you later.